This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.
Henry Fleming was a young man from New York, his head filled with idealistic dreams of heroism. His decision to enlist in the Union Army during the American Civil War would alter the course of his life forever. The air hung heavy with anticipation as Henry prepared to leave his family farm. His mind raced like a wild stallion, galloping through visions of glory. He saw himself as a Greek warrior of old, invincible and revered, his name etched in the annals of history. Yet beneath this veneer of bravado, a seed of doubt took root, its tendrils wrapping around his heart, whispering questions about his own courage. Night fell, stretching endlessly before him. Henry tossed and turned in his bed, the familiar creaks of the farmhouse a haunting reminder of the comfort he was about to abandon. His thoughts fluttered like restless birds, darting between grand fantasies of valor and paralyzing fears of cowardice. The question loomed large in his mind. What if, when faced with real danger, he faltered? The weight of this uncertainty pressed heavily on his chest, making sleep as elusive as smoke in the wind. Dawn broke, painting the sky in a palette of pink and gold, a beauty Henry barely registered. His mother, a woman hardened by years of farm life, stood in the doorway like a sentinel. Her face, usually as stern as weathered oak, softened as she gazed at her son. She spoke not of glory or patriotism, but of practical matters, clean socks and good company. Her words, simple yet profound, carried the weight of a mother's love and worry, each syllable etched with concern. With hands that had kneaded countless loaves of bread and mended innumerable shirts, she pressed a package into Henry's hands. It was food for his journey, wrapped carefully in brown paper, a last offering of home and hearth. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Henry saw the tears his mother refused to shed. A lump formed in his throat, threatening to shatter his facade of bravery like glass against stone. As Henry walked away from the only home he'd ever known, his steps were a mixture of eagerness and reluctance. The familiar sights of his village seemed to wave goodbye. The old oak tree where he'd played as a child, its branches reaching out like farewell arms. The crooked fence he'd helped his father mend, a testament to shared labor and love. Each step took him further from boyhood and closer to the man he hoped to become. The ground beneath his feet a bridge between two worlds. The train station buzzed with activity, a hive of nervous energy. Young men, some barely older than boys, crowded the platform. Their faces mirrored Henry's own emotions, excitement tinged with fear, bravado masking uncertainty. As Henry boarded the train, the rhythmic chugging of the engine seemed to echo his racing heart, a mechanical beat to match the pulse of his anticipation. The familiar landscape of home gave way to unknown territories, fields and forests blurring past the window like memories fading into mist. Inside the train car, a cacophony of voices rose and fell. Some spoke of glory and adventure, their words bright and sharp like new bayonets. Others murmured of duty and honor, their tones somber as a bugle's last note. Henry listened, his own thoughts a jumble of hopes and fears, each word from his fellow recruits adding to the tumult in his mind. As the train carried him towards an uncertain future, Henry Fleming stood on the threshold of manhood, teetering between the boy he was and the soldier he would become. The familiar sights of his village faded into memory, replaced by the looming unknown. The train, filled with other young recruits, buzzed with a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the adventures that awaited them all. As dusk fell, the train slowed, approaching their destination. Henry's heart raced, his palms slick with sweat. Through the window he caught his first glimpse of the army camp, a sea of tents stretching as far as the eye could see. The reality of war, no longer a distant concept, now stood before him, tangible and overwhelming. With a deep breath, Henry steeled himself for what was to come. The train doors opened, and he stepped out into the unknown, the scent of gunpowder and sweat filling his nostrils, a stark reminder of the new world he had entered. Henry's heart pounded as he stepped into the bustling army camp. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and sweat, a stark reminder of the new world he had entered. The cacophony of shouts, clanging metal, and stomping boots assaulted his senses, making his head spin. He swallowed hard, trying to quell the nervous flutter in his stomach. In an instant, Henry found himself swept up in the relentless tide of military life. The once familiar rhythm of his days on the farm melted away like morning dew, replaced by a rigid schedule that seemed to tick by with mechanical precision. Every morning he rose before the sun, his body aching from sleeping on the hard ground. The drill sergeant's voice became his new alarm clock, harsh and unforgiving. Henry learned to march, his feet moving in perfect unison with his fellow soldiers. The thunderous beat of their boots against the hard-packed earth became a constant companion, drowning out the doubts that whispered in the back of his mind. His hands, once soft from farm work, grew calloused and rough. The rifle, initially an awkward and foreign object, became an extension of his body. He cleaned it meticulously, the cool metal beneath his touch a constant reminder of its deadly purpose. The camp itself was a hive of constant activity, never truly sleeping. Shouts of drill sergeants cut through the air like whip cracks, making Henry flinch even when they weren't directed at him. The clatter of supply wagons and the whinnying of horses provided a constant backdrop, a chaotic symphony of war preparation. Amidst this whirlwind, Henry found an unexpected ally in Jim Conklin. The tall, seasoned soldier stood out like a sturdy oak in a field of saplings. Jim's eyes, which had seen their fair share of battles, held a quiet confidence that drew Henry like a moth to a flame. When the weight of his new responsibilities threatened to crush him, Jim's steady presence was a lifeline, offering guidance with a few well-chosen words or a simple nod of understanding. In stark contrast to Jim's reassuring presence was Wilson, a brash young soldier whose voice seemed to carry across the entire camp. Henry watched with a mix of fascination and unease as Wilson spun tales of imagined heroics, each more outlandish than the last. The boastful claims rang hollow in Henry's ears, and he couldn't help but wonder if his own fears were as transparent to others as Wilson's bravado was to him. As the sun dipped below the horizon each evening, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Henry found himself drawn to the campfires where veterans gathered. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across weathered faces as they shared stories of battles past. Henry listened with rapt attention, his imagination conjuring scenes of smoke-filled fields and clashing armies. The veterans' words painted vivid pictures, filling the air with phantom gunshots and the clash of steel. One night, a grizzled soldier with a jagged scar running down his cheek recounted a particularly gruesome charge. His gravelly voice dropped to a near whisper as he described the chaos of battle, the air thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. Henry felt the color drain from his face, his stomach churning as he struggled to reconcile the glory he had imagined with the brutal reality of war. The campfire suddenly felt too hot, the air too thick to breathe. Days bled into weeks, each one indistinguishable from the last. The promised battle remained elusive, a mirage always shimmering on the horizon, but never within reach. The waiting gnawed at Henry like a hungry beast, feeding his growing anxiety. In the quiet moments between drills and duties, he found himself questioning his decision to enlist. The weight of his choice pressed down on him with each passing hour, a constant companion heavier than any pack he carried. Had he made a terrible mistake? The thought haunted him, creeping into his dreams and leaving him restless, tossing and turning on his thin bedroll. As the monotony of camp life stretched on, Henry's initial excitement curdled into a desperate longing for action. He yearned for the clash of battle, not out of bloodlust, but from a deep-seated need to prove himself, to silence the doubts that whispered in the dark corners of his mind. The waiting had become almost unbearable, a test of endurance more challenging than any physical drill. His muscles ached for movement, his mind for purpose. Henry found himself caught in a paradox of emotions, dreading the horrors of war, yet craving the opportunity to face them. He stood on the precipice of manhood, teetering between the boy he had been and the soldier he hoped to become. As night fell on another uneventful day, Henry stared into the flickering flames of the campfire, his heart aching for a resolution to the gnawing self-doubt that had become his constant companion. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the edge of the camp. Soldiers scrambled to their feet, voices rising in a confused jumble. Henry's heart leapt into his throat as he saw a messenger sprinting towards the officer's tent, his face flushed and urgent. The air in the camp seemed to shift, crackling with a new electric energy. Henry's palms began to sweat as he realized that everything was about to change. The waiting was over. Their true test was about to begin. The air in the camp crackled with nervous energy. Henry's regiment had finally received their marching orders, signaling the end of weeks of waiting and the beginning of their true test. In an instant, the once quiet camp erupted into a frenzy of activity. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air as soldiers hastily packed their meager belongings. Hands trembled, fumbling with straps and buckles, betraying the mix of excitement and fear that coursed through their veins. Voices called out, some cracking with forced bravado, others barely above a whisper. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he stuffed his pack. His fingers moved mechanically, but his mind raced with conflicting emotions. He had dreamed of this moment, yearned for the chance to prove himself in battle. But now that it had arrived, a cold knot of fear settled in his stomach, twisting and churning like a living thing. As the regiment began to move out, the peaceful countryside Henry had grown accustomed to transformed before his eyes. The once lush fields lay trampled and barren, as if a great beast had devoured every blade of grass. Abandoned farmhouses stood like skeletons against the sky, their empty windows staring accusingly at the passing soldiers. In the distance, Henry caught glimpses of refugees, their faces etched with weariness and fear as they fled the approaching conflict. Their haunted eyes seemed to bore into him, silently asking why he marched towards the very thing they were running from. The physical toll of the march soon made itself known. With each step, Henry felt as if hot coals were being pressed against his feet. Blisters formed and burst, leaving his socks sticky with blood and pus. The weight of his pack seemed to increase with every mile, digging into his shoulders like cruel talons. The air around him was thick with dust, kicked up by thousands of marching feet, coating his throat and leaving him parched and gasping. He longed for water, but the canteens were rationed, and the next stream was miles away. As they trudged on, Henry watched his fellow soldiers with a mix of pity and dread. Some men, their faces twisted in agony, fell out of line, unable to keep up with the punishing pace. Others marched on with grim determination, their eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon. Henry wondered which group he would eventually join. Progress was agonizingly slow, and in the absence of clear information, rumors spread through the ranks like wildfire. Each whispered conversation brought new speculation about their destination and the enemy's whereabouts. Some spoke of imminent victory, while others muttered darkly about walking into a trap. Henry found himself hanging on every word, desperate for any information that might prepare him for what lay ahead. As night fell and the regiment made camp, Henry found himself unable to sleep. The distant rumble of artillery fire reached his ears, a sound both terrifying and thrilling. It was like the growl of some great beast, hungry for blood and glory. With each boom, the reality of what lay ahead became more tangible, more immediate. Henry's imagination ran wild, conjuring images of the carnage that awaited them. He tossed and turned on the hard ground, his mind a battlefield of its own. In the flickering light of the campfires, Henry observed a change come over the veteran soldiers. The cocky grins and boastful tales that had been their trademark gave way to a tense silence. When they did speak, their jokes took on a darker, more fatalistic tone. It was as if a shadow had fallen over them, a premonition of the trials to come. Henry watched them closely, searching for any sign of the courage he hoped to find within himself. As they drew closer to the front lines, the transformation in the veteran soldiers became even more pronounced. Their usual bravado melted away like morning mist, replaced by a quiet tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. Even the most seasoned warriors among them grew contemplative, their eyes distant and haunted. Henry felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that if these battle-hardened men were afraid, what hope did he have? The regiment pushed on, each step bringing them closer to the unknown. The landscape became increasingly scarred by war. Shell craters pockmarked the earth, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Henry's senses were on high alert, every rustle in the bushes or distant shout sending a jolt of adrenaline through his body. As the sun began to set on their final day of marching, an eerie calm settled over the troops. The constant chatter and movement that had accompanied their journey fell away, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Henry could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, each pulse a countdown to the moment of truth. Suddenly, the stillness was shattered by a sound that made every man freeze in his tracks. In the distance, carried on the evening breeze, came the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Henry's blood ran cold as he realized that their moment had finally arrived. The baptism of fire he had both longed for and dreaded was upon them, and there was no turning back. The eerie silence was shattered by the sudden crack of gunfire. Henry's regiment found itself thrust into its first skirmish, a small but intense engagement that would serve as his baptism by fire. Henry's heart pounded like a drum, each beat threatening to burst through his chest. His legs, once steady and sure, now quivered beneath him like saplings in a storm. The acrid stench of gunpowder filled his nostrils, stinging his eyes and making them water. For a fleeting moment, panic gripped him, his instincts screaming to flee, to escape the chaos erupting around him. But then, through the haze of smoke and fear, he caught sight of his comrades. They stood firm, their faces etched with grim determination. Their resolve acted like an invisible anchor, rooting Henry to the spot. He couldn't run, not now, not when they all stood together against this storm of lead and fire. With hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, Henry raised his rifle. The weight of it, once familiar from countless drills, now seemed as heavy as a cannon. He squinted through the smoke, trying to make out the enemy lines. But all he could see was a wall of gray haze, punctuated by angry flashes of light and the occasional dark silhouette. Henry fired into the smoke-filled air, the kick of the rifle jolting through his body like a bolt of lightning. The noise was deafening, a constant barrage that seemed to swallow up every other sound. He found himself caught up in a strange mechanical rhythm. Load, aim, fire, repeat. Time lost all meaning as he moved through these motions, swept up in the frenzy of battle. The skirmish ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. As the last echoes of gunfire faded away, Henry felt a tidal wave of emotions wash over him. Relief flooded through his veins, followed closely by a swell of pride. He had done it. He had stood his ground, faced the enemy, and lived to tell the tale. But his elation was short-lived. As the smoke began to clear, revealing the aftermath of the battle, Henry's stomach churned like a stormy sea. Bodies lay scattered across the field, some in Union blue, others in Confederate gray. The sight hit him like a physical blow, driving home the brutal reality of war. These weren't faceless enemies or nameless allies. They were men just like him, who would never see another sunrise. The news of Jim Conklin's injury came as another shock, like a bucket of ice water dumped over his head. Henry helped carry his friend to the field hospital, his arms aching from the weight. The hospital was a place of nightmares, a vision of hell on earth. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sour stench of infection. Groans and cries of pain filled the air, a chorus of suffering that made Henry's skin crawl. He fought back waves of nausea as he navigated through rows of wounded men, their injuries a gruesome testament to the cost of war. As night fell, Henry retreated to his tent. The canvas walls seemed to close in around him like a shroud as he lay on his bedroll, staring up at nothing. Sleep eluded him, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He replayed the day's events over and over, each time seeing something new, feeling something different. The pride he had felt at standing his ground now warred with the horror of what he had witnessed. The faces of the dead and wounded haunted him, appearing every time he closed his eyes. And beneath it all, a gnawing fear grew in the pit of his stomach, like a cold, hard stone. This had been just a skirmish, a taste of what was to come. How would he fare in the bigger battles that loomed on the horizon? As the night wore on, Henry lay awake, his mind filled with questions he couldn't answer and fears he couldn't quell. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, as if the very air was holding its breath. In the distance, he could hear the faint sounds of movement, the shuffling of feet, the clinking of equipment. Something was happening out there in the darkness. Suddenly, a commotion erupted outside his tent. Urgent whispers and hurried footsteps broke the night's stillness. Henry sat up, his heart racing once again. What new horror awaited them? As he reached for his rifle, a fellow soldier burst into the tent, his face pale in the dim light. "Henry, get up! The Confederates are on the move. We're about to be hit, and hit hard." The dawn broke, casting a pale light over the battlefield. It heralded a day of reckoning for Henry's regiment, as they found themselves squarely in the path of a full-scale Confederate attack. A chill ran down Henry's spine as he watched the sun climb higher, its rays illuminating the grim faces of his fellow soldiers. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with the scent of gunpowder and fear. In the distance, a flock of birds took flight, startled by the growing rumble of approaching troops. Suddenly, the enemy's battle line appeared on the horizon. It was a sea of gray uniforms, advancing like storm clouds, ready to unleash their fury. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of his mortality. His fingers tightened around his rifle, the cold metal a stark contrast to his clammy palms. He glanced at his comrade, their faces a mirror of his own conflicted emotions. Some stood tall, jaws clenched in determination. Others fidgeted nervously, eyes darting back and forth like cornered animals. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional cough or whispered prayer. Then all at once, the world erupted into chaos. The peaceful morning shattered under a hail of gunfire, the air filled with acrid smoke, stinging Henry's eyes and throat. The metallic tang of blood mixed with the earthy smell of churned mud, creating a nauseating cocktail that threatened to overwhelm his senses. Henry's ears rang with the cacophony of battle, the thunderous roar of rifles, the sharp crack of artillery, and the haunting screams of the wounded. Each sound seemed to pierce through him, rattling his very bones. At first, Henry fought with a fervor that surprised even himself. His movements became automatic, driven by adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive. Load, aim, fire. Load, aim, fire. The rhythm of battle consumed him, momentarily drowning out his fears. The recoil of his rifle bruised his shoulder, but he barely noticed, focused solely on the next target, the next threat. But as the fighting intensified, doubt began to creep in like a poisonous fog. Henry watched in horror as men fell around him, their bodies crumpling like rag dolls. Blood stained the ground, turning the earth into a gruesome canvas of death. The enemy seemed endless, an unstoppable tide of gray washing over their position. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. Some of his fellow soldiers were retreating, their courage finally buckling under the weight of the onslaught. The sight ignited a spark of panic in Henry's chest, quickly fanning into an inferno of fear. His mind raced, conjuring vivid images of his own death. He saw himself lying broken and forgotten on this blood-soaked field, his body trampled underfoot by the advancing enemy. The urge to flee became overwhelming, a physical ache that consumed every fiber of his being. In a moment of weakness that would haunt him for years to come, Henry succumbed to his terror. His fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled with his rifle. The weapon clattered to the ground, abandoned like his honor. With a strangled cry that tore from his throat, he turned and ran, pushing past his stunned comrades. As he fled, the sounds of battle pursued him like vengeful spirits. Each labored breath felt like a betrayal, each footfall an admission of cowardice. Yet he couldn't stop, driven by a primal need to survive that overrode all else. Henry's mind, desperate to justify his actions, grasped at straws of rationalization. "I'm preserving myself for future battles," he thought frantically, his lungs burning with each gasping breath. "This is the sensible choice. I can't fight if I'm dead." But deep in his heart, where truth resided, shame began to take root. It grew with each step, a crushing weight that threatened to bring him to his knees. The taste of bile rose in his throat, bitter and acrid. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled, putting as much distance between himself and the battle as possible. Branches whipped at his face, leaving stinging welts, but he barely noticed. Eventually, the sounds of conflict faded, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by his ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. Henry found himself in a quiet stretch of wilderness, the peaceful scenery a stark contrast to the hell he'd left behind. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, indifferent to the human drama unfolding nearby. Birds chirped, their cheerful songs a mockery of his inner turmoil. As the adrenaline ebbed away, the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. He was alone, cut off from his unit, a deserter in a hostile land. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him dizzy and disoriented. Henry sank to the ground, his back against a gnarled oak tree, and buried his face in his hands. Questions swirled in his mind like leaves caught in a whirlwind. What would he do now? How could he ever face his comrades again? The answers eluded him, lost in a haze of guilt and fear. As the day wore on, Henry remained there, trapped between the battle behind him and an uncertain future ahead. The sounds of distant fighting had faded to nothing, leaving him alone with the pounding of his own heart and the crushing weight of his guilt. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. Henry knew he couldn't stay here forever, but the thought of moving filled him with dread. What horrors awaited him in the gathering darkness? With trembling legs, he forced himself to stand, his eyes darting nervously between the shadowy trunks. As night fell, Henry took his first tentative steps into the unknown, the forest closing in around him like a tomb. Henry wandered aimlessly through a dense forest, alone and filled with shame. The peaceful surroundings stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the battlefield he had left behind. The soft crunch of leaves beneath his feet echoed in the eerie silence, a constant reminder of his solitude. Overhead, branches swayed gently in the breeze, their rustling a mockery of the thunderous explosions that still rang in his ears. As he pushed deeper into the woods, Henry's mind raced like a spooked horse. Relief washed over him in waves, grateful to have escaped the jaws of death that had snapped shut around so many of his comrades. But hot on its heels came the crushing weight of guilt, threatening to suffocate him with every ragged breath. "I ran," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I abandoned them." Fear gnawed at his insides, a constant companion whispering of the consequences should he be discovered. Deserter. The word hung in the air like a noose waiting to tighten around his neck. Henry's feet carried him forward even as his mind reeled backward, reliving those moments of terror and shame. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees looming like silent judges passing sentence on his cowardice. Suddenly, the world tilted on its axis. Henry's eyes fell upon a sight that stopped him dead in his tracks, his blood turning to ice in his veins. There, propped against a gnarled oak tree, sat the body of a dead soldier. The man's uniform, once a proud blue, was now stained a deep crimson. But it was the eyes that captured Henry, held him transfixed in horror. Glassy and lifeless, they seemed to stare directly into his soul, accusing and condemning all at once. Henry's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The corpse before him was a stark reminder of the fate he had fled, the duty he had abandoned. In those sightless eyes, he saw reflected his own weakness, his own failure. Panic seized him, and primal urge to flee overwhelming all rational thought. Henry turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. Branches whipped at his face, roots threatened to trip him at every step, but still he ran. He ran from the dead soldier, from his guilt, from himself. The forest blurred around him, a green and brown smear as he tore through the undergrowth. His lungs burned, legs trembling with each desperate stride. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was lost, alone, with no idea how to find his way back to his unit, or if he even could. Fate, it seemed, had other plans. Henry's aimless wanderings brought him to a dirt road cutting through the forest. For a moment, hope flared in his chest like a match struck in darkness. But that hope was quickly tempered by the sight that greeted him. A column of wounded men, retreating from the battle he had fled. A mix of emotions washed over Henry as he fell in step with the battered soldiers. Relief at finding some semblance of companionship warred with a renewed sense of shame. Here he was, whole and uninjured, while these men bore the visible scars of their courage. The procession was a grim tableau of war's brutality. Men limped along on makeshift crutches, their faces etched with pain. Others were carried on stretchers, their wounds too severe to allow them to walk. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder that clung to their uniforms like a shroud. Henry walked among them, acutely aware of how he stood out. His unmarked body was a beacon, drawing questioning glances and suspicious looks. Each step felt like a confession, his lack of injury a visible sign of his cowardice for all to see. As they trudged onward, Henry's mind churned with conflicting emotions. The sight of these men who had stood their ground and paid the price filled him with a mixture of awe and self-loathing. Their bravery threw his own actions into sharp relief, a constant reminder of his failure to live up to the ideals of a soldier. Yet even as shame threatened to overwhelm him, a small part of Henry clung to the hope of redemption. Perhaps, he thought, there was still a chance to prove himself, to wash away the stain of his cowardice. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty road, Henry felt a shift in the air. The wounded soldiers around him seemed to move with renewed urgency, their faces etched with a mix of pain and determination. Something was changing, and Henry couldn't shake the feeling that his journey was far from over. With each step, the weight of his guilt pressed down on him, but so too did the growing sense that his true test was yet to come. Henry trudged along with a group of wounded soldiers, his heart heavy with guilt and shame. The scorching sun beat down on them mercilessly, casting long shadows across the dusty road. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder, a constant reminder of the battle they'd left behind. Each step sent jolts of pain through Henry's body, though his wounds were imaginary. His eyes darted nervously from face to face, terrified someone might recognize him as a deserter. The rhythmic thud of boots on dirt and the occasional groan of pain were the only sounds breaking the eerie silence. A tattered soldier, his uniform hanging in shreds, kept glancing at Henry with curious eyes. "Where you hit?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to scrape against Henry's ears. Henry's stomach churned, bile rising in his throat. He fumbled for words, his mind racing to concoct a believable lie. It's not bad," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. The tattered soldier persisted, his innocent questions like daggers to Henry's conscience. With each inquiry, Henry's discomfort grew, his responses becoming more vague and evasive. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and not just from the heat. Suddenly, a familiar face emerged from the crowd of wounded men. Jim Conklin, Henry's friend from his regiment, stumbled forward. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, and his uniform was stained dark with blood. The sight hit Henry like a physical blow. "Jim!" Henry cried out, a mix of relief and horror washing over him. His friend's appearance was a stark reminder of the reality he'd fled from. Together with the tattered soldier, Henry rushed to Jim's side. They supported him as best they could, but Jim's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His skin was pale as ash, and his breathing came in short, ragged gasps that seemed to rattle in his chest. The trio limped along, a grotesque dance of the dying. Jim's fevered mumblings filled the air, punctuated by moments of eerie lucidity. Henry's heart ached as he watched his friend slip away, powerless to help. The weight of his own cowardice pressed down on him, making each step a struggle. Without warning, Jim broke free from their grasp. With a burst of strength that seemed to come from nowhere, he sprinted towards a nearby field. Henry and the tattered soldier could only watch in stunned silence as Jim ran, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet with tangled strings. Jim's flight was short-lived. He collapsed in the field, his body crumpling like a rag doll tossed aside. Henry rushed to his side, the dry grass crunching under his feet. But it was too late. Jim's eyes, once full of life and laughter, now stared blankly at the sky, reflecting the endless blue above. The cruel reality of war hit Henry like a cannonball to the chest. He had seen death before, but never so personal, never so raw. Jim's lifeless form seemed to mock Henry's own cowardice, his desertion from the battlefield. The stench of death filled his nostrils, making him gag. Overwhelmed by grief and shame, Henry's mind reeled. The tattered soldier's voice faded to a distant buzz as panic clawed at Henry's chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of his actions, his lies, and the suffering around him became too much to bear. The world seemed to spin, the horizon tilting crazily. In a moment of blind panic, Henry did the unthinkable. He turned and ran, abandoning the tattered soldier who was himself on the brink of death. Henry's feet pounded the earth, each step taking him further from the dying man who needed his help. The wind whistled in his ears, drowning out the voice of his conscience. As he fled, guilt consumed him like a raging fire. Not only had he deserted his comrades in battle, but now he had left a dying man alone. The shame of his actions burned in his chest, threatening to consume him entirely. Henry ran on, a solitary figure against the war-torn landscape, fleeing not just from the horrors around him, but from the person he had become. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but still he ran. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him with accusing fingers. As darkness began to fall, Henry's steps faltered. He stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and emotion. In the gathering gloom, a new thought took hold, as insistent as a bugle call. He had to make this right. He had to find his way back. With the last of his strength, Henry turned his face towards where he thought his regiment might be. Guilt gnawed at his insides, driving him forward into the unknown night. Guilt gnawed at Henry's insides, consuming him from within. It drove him to seek out his regiment, desperate to escape the shame of his desertion and rejoin his comrades. The battlefield stretched before him, a hellish landscape of smoke and chaos. Blue and gray uniforms swirled together in a deadly dance, the air thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder and fear. Henry's heart pounded against his ribs as he stumbled forward, his eyes darting wildly from one unfamiliar face to another. Retreating soldiers pushed past him, their faces etched with exhaustion and terror. The ground beneath his feet trembled with each cannon blast, sending shockwaves through his body. The cacophony of gunfire and shouted orders assaulted his ears, disorienting him further. Suddenly, a blinding pain exploded in his skull. The world tilted sideways, stars bursting behind his eyes. A Union soldier, wild-eyed and frantic, had struck Henry with the butt of his rifle. In the fog of war, friend and foe blurred together, and Henry had become an unwitting victim of friendly fire. Blood trickled down Henry's face, warm and sticky. The coppery taste filled his mouth, mingling with the bitter flavor of fear and regret. He staggered through the battlefield like a wounded animal, each step sending waves of dizziness through his body. His thoughts were a jumble of confusion and self-pity, the weight of his cowardice pressing down on him like a physical force. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, a cheerful voice cut through the haze of pain. "Hey there, friend! You look like you could use a hand." A soldier with kind eyes and steady hands materialized at Henry's side, offering support and guidance. This good Samaritan became Henry's lifeline, a beacon of hope in the chaos of war. Together they navigated the treacherous landscape, the cheery soldier's optimism a stark contrast to the grim reality surrounding them. His words of encouragement were like a soothing balm to Henry's battered spirit, easing the ache of guilt that gnawed at his insides. As they neared the Union lines, Henry became acutely aware of the curious glances and sympathetic murmurs directed his way. His wound, a badge of courage in the eyes of his fellow soldiers, was assumed to be a battle scar earned in the heat of combat. A flicker of hope ignited in Henry's chest. Here was a chance to salvage his reputation, to bury the truth of his cowardice beneath a lie of bravery. The temptation was too great to resist. Henry remained silent, allowing the misunderstanding to take root and grow. With each nod of respect and word of admiration from passing soldiers, a mixture of relief and shame coursed through him. It was as if he were watching himself from a distance, marveling at the ease with which this deception unfolded. Familiar faces emerged from the crowd as they approached the camp. Henry's heart leaped at the sight of his regiment, a bitter-sweet homecoming tinged with the weight of his secret. His comrades rushed to greet him, their concern evident in their furrowed brows and gentle hands. Among them was Wilson, a man transformed. Gone was the boastful bravado of before, replaced by a quiet strength and genuine compassion. He helped Henry to his tent, his touch careful and considerate. The change in Wilson was like a mirror, reflecting Henry's own inner turmoil and growth. Inside the tent, Surrounded by the worried faces of his fellow soldiers, Henry settled onto his cot. Their attentive care was both a comfort and a torment. Each kind word, each gentle pat on the shoulder, was a reminder of the lie that now stood between them. The air in the tent felt thick and oppressive, heavy with unspoken truths. As night fell and the camp grew quiet, Henry lay awake, staring into the darkness. The weight of his deception pressed down on him like a physical force, threatening to crush him. Fear of discovery coiled in his stomach, a venomous snake ready to strike at any moment. He wondered how long he could maintain this facade, and what price he would ultimately pay for his moment of weakness on the battlefield. In the stillness of the night, Henry grappled with the consequences of his choices. The wound on his head throbbed in time with his racing thoughts, a painful reminder of the tangled web he had woven. As exhaustion finally claimed him, Henry drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of battles both real and imagined. The first hints of dawn began to creep across the sky, painting the horizon in soft hues of pink and gold. Henry stirred, his eyes fluttering open to the new day. But as he gazed out at the battlefield, a chill ran down his spine. The long shadows stretching across the land seemed to reach for him, accusing fingers pointing at his deceit. In the eerie stillness of the morning, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this day would bring a reckoning, and that his carefully constructed lie was about to come crashing down around him. The morning light crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. Long shadows stretched across the battlefield, casting an eerie stillness over the soon-to-be chaos. Henry's head throbbed, a constant reminder of his recent wound. Despite the lingering pain and the fear that gnawed at his insides, he found himself mechanically preparing for another clash with the enemy. His regiment bustled around him, a sea of nervous energy and grim determination. The air hung heavy with anticipation, thick enough to choke on. The only sounds breaking the tense silence were the metallic clicks of weapons being checked and loaded. Henry's hands shook as he fumbled with his rifle, the cold metal slick with his sweat. His mind raced, replaying scenes of his previous cowardice like a cruel theater show. He sucked in a deep breath, the acrid smell of gunpowder already tickling his nostrils. This time would be different, he told himself. This time he'd prove his worth. As the soldiers formed their lines, Henry's gaze darted from face to face. Some wore masks of steely resolve, jaws clenched and eyes narrowed. Others couldn't hide the flickers of fear, their eyes wide and darting. He wondered if they could see the doubt etched in his own features, the shame that churned in his gut like a living thing. Without warning, the world exploded into chaos. The thunderous roar of artillery shattered the morning calm, the ground beneath their feet trembling as if the earth itself was cowering. Henry's world narrowed to a blur of smoke and noise, his senses overwhelmed. The acrid stench of gunpowder filled his lungs, making him want to gag. Almost on instinct, he raised his rifle, his finger finding the trigger as if drawn by an invisible force. The once peaceful field transformed into a hellscape. Men fell around him like rag dolls, their screams of agony barely audible over the constant barrage of gunfire. Blood soaked into the earth, turning the ground beneath their feet into a crimson mud. Where once Henry might have fled in blind panic, he now found himself rooted to the spot. A strange fire ignited in his chest, spreading through his veins like liquid courage. With each pull of the trigger, Henry felt a surge of something. Was it bravery, desperation, or just the raw, animal instinct to survive? Whatever it was, it propelled him forward. His movements became more fluid, more purposeful, as if he were a machine, built for this very moment. Through the haze of smoke, Henry caught sight of Wilson nearby. His once cocky friend now wore an expression of fierce concentration, all bravado stripped away by the reality of battle. Their eyes met for a brief instant, a wordless understanding passing between them. In that fleeting moment, Henry grasped the true meaning of brotherhood forged in the crucible of war. As the fighting intensified, Henry's world shrank to a series of simple, repetitive actions. Load, aim, fire. The doubts that had once paralyzed him were pushed aside, replaced by a laser-like focus on survival. Each successful shot felt like a small victory, a step towards redemption for his past failures. The battle raged on, a tempest of violence and chaos swirling around him. Yet within this storm, Henry found an unexpected island of calm. His fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it had morphed into something else, a driving force that pushed him forward rather than holding him back. As the smoke began to thin and the gunfire grew sporadic, Henry realized that something fundamental had shifted within him. The battle wasn't over, far from it, but he had faced it head-on. In doing so, he had unearthed a strength he never knew he possessed, buried beneath layers of self-doubt and fear. Henry's focus remained razor-sharp, his world narrowed to the immediate tasks at hand, loading, aiming, firing. There was no room for the crippling doubts that once plagued his every waking moment. In the crucible of battle, he had found not just his courage, but a part of himself he thought lost forever. Just as Henry began to feel a glimmer of hope, a fresh wave of enemy soldiers emerged from the dissipating smoke. The chaos of battle engulfed him once more, swallowing him in a maelstrom of gunfire and screams. Amidst the fury, his eyes locked onto a sight that made his blood run cold, a sight that would alter the course of his life forever. The chaos of battle engulfed Henry, swallowing him in a maelstrom of smoke and gunfire. Amidst the fury, he witnessed a sight that would alter the course of his life forever. The regiment's flag-bearer, a beacon of hope in the hellish landscape, crumpled to the ground. The man's body jerked violently as enemy bullets tore through his flesh, his grip on the flag loosening as life drained from his eyes. Time slowed to a crawl. Henry's heart thundered in his chest, drowning out the cacophony of war. His legs moved of their own accord, propelling him forward through the haze of gunpowder and death. The acrid smell of smoke filled his nostrils, making his eyes water as he lunged for the falling flag. His fingers grasped the rough fabric just before it could touch the blood-soaked earth. The weight of the banner surprised him, as if it carried not just cloth and wood, but the very souls of his fallen comrades. As Henry lifted it high, a curious sensation washed over him, starting in his gut and spreading outward like wildfire. The gnawing fear that had plagued him since the battle began melted away. In its place, a steely resolve took root, straightening his spine and setting his jaw. Henry felt as if he'd shed his old skin, leaving behind the frightened boy who had once run from battle. Around him, the tide of war seemed to shift. Soldiers who moments before had been lost in the fog of battle now turned their eyes to the flag. It was as if a lighthouse had suddenly appeared in a stormy sea, guiding them through the chaos. Henry saw the change ripple through the ranks, despair giving way to determination, mirroring the transformation in his own heart. With each step forward, Henry felt the metamorphosis within himself deepen. The flag whipped and snapped in the wind above him, a defiant challenge to the enemy. Bullets whistled past, kicking up dirt at his feet and sending tiny shards of earth stinging against his skin. The cries of the wounded echoed in his ears, a haunting chorus of agony and desperation. Yet Henry pushed on, each footfall more certain than the last. He was no longer just a soldier in the ranks. He had become a symbol, a rallying point for his fellow men. The weight of their hopes and fears pressed down on him, but instead of crushing him, it fueled his resolve. The regiment surged forward, drawing strength from Henry's unwavering advance. Men who had cowered behind cover now charged with renewed vigor, their bayonets glinting in the sun like the teeth of some great, awakening beast. The enemy line, so formidable just moments ago, began to waver under the assault. As he pressed on, Henry's mind flashed back to his earlier doubts and fears. How small and distant they seemed now, like childhood nightmares fading in the harsh light of day. Each step, each moment he held the flag aloft, was a victory over his former self. The battle raged on around him, a tempest of sound and fury. But for Henry, the world had narrowed to a singular focus. Keep moving. Keep the flag high. His arms ached, muscles screaming in protest. His lungs burned with each ragged breath, the air thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Still, he refused to falter. In this moment, he was more than just Henry. He was the embodiment of courage itself. The transformation that had begun within him spread outward, infecting his comrades with a fierce determination. They fought not just for victory, but for each other, for the ideal that Henry and the flag represented. As the sun began to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked field, Henry found himself at the forefront of the regiment's advance. The weight of the flag had become a part of him, an extension of his will. His role as flag bearer was no longer just a duty, it was a physical manifestation of his journey from a frightened boy to a man forged in the fires of war. The battle was far from over, but something had fundamentally changed. As night began to fall, Henry stood tall amidst the chaos, the flag held high above him. His eyes blazed with a newfound determination, a fire that would not be easily extinguished. The once timid soldier had been reborn in the crucible of combat, emerging as something altogether different and dangerous. Henry's transformation was evident in every aspect of his behavior on the battlefield. The once timid soldier now stood tall amidst the chaos of war, his eyes blazing with determination. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled his nostrils, and the deafening roar of cannons shook the very ground beneath his feet. As bullets whizzed past, their high-pitched whine a constant reminder of death's proximity, Henry found himself at the forefront of each assault. His voice, once hesitant and unsure, now rose above the din, rallying his comrades with a strength he never knew he possessed. "Forward, men," he shouted, his words carrying over the cacophony of battle. "We push on." In one particularly brutal engagement, the air grew thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Henry felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders as he was thrust into the heart of the fray. The metallic taste of fear lingered on his tongue, but he swallowed it down, replacing it with grim determination. Ammunition ran low, the clicks of empty chambers echoing around him. But Henry's resolve never wavered. With a primal yell that tore from deep within his chest, he gripped his rifle like a club. The weapon's metal gleamed dully in the smoky light, an extension of his arm as he swung it in wide, desperate arcs. The impact of metal on flesh sent shockwaves up his arms as he felled enemy soldiers who dared to come too close. Each blow was a testament to his transformation, the fear that once paralyzed him now fueling his every move. Officers who had once dismissed the young recruit now watched in awe as Henry moved through the battlefield like a force of nature. "Look at that boy go," one captain shouted, his voice a mix of surprise and admiration cutting through the chaos. "He's fighting like he's got the devil in him." Henry's fellow soldiers, once cowering behind whatever cover they could find, felt themselves swept up in his wake. The fire in his eyes ignited something within them, a spark of courage they thought long extinguished. They followed him into the thick of battle, drawing strength from his unwavering bravery. Wilson, Henry's once boastful companion, underwent a transformation of his own. Gone was the loud bravado, replaced by a quiet, steely determination that mirrored Henry's own change. He fought alongside his friend with a silent intensity, the two forming an unspoken bond in the crucible of combat. They moved in tandem, a deadly dance amid the chaos. "Watch your left, Henry," Wilson would call out, his words barely audible over the din. Henry would nod, adjusting his stance, trusting his friend implicitly. Their rifles spoke in a deadly duet, each shot finding its mark with terrifying accuracy. As the regiment faced each new challenge, Henry's reputation grew like a legend taking shape before their very eyes. Stories of his exploits spread through the camp like wildfire, whispered around flickering campfires and shouted across muddy trenches. "Did you hear about that Henry kid?" soldiers would ask, eyes wide with wonder. "They say he charged a whole platoon by himself." The fear that had once gripped Henry's heart, squeezing the very breath from his lungs, was now a distant memory. In its place stood a man forged in the fires of war, his resolve as unyielding as the iron of his bayonet. With each passing day, each hard-fought battle, Henry felt a deeper connection to the men around him. These were no longer strangers in uniform, but brothers bound by blood and gunpowder. As the sun began to set on another day of carnage, Henry found himself atop a small rise, surveying the battlefield. The acrid smell of spent cartridges hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Smoke drifted lazily across the scarred earth, partially obscuring the bodies of the fallen. But amidst the destruction, Henry felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. The fear that once consumed him had been replaced by a steely resolve and a deep sense of loyalty to his fellow soldiers. In the fading light, with the sounds of battle still echoing in his ears, Henry knew he had found his place in this terrible, beautiful struggle for survival. As darkness began to fall, an unsettling quiet descended upon the battlefield. The constant barrage of gunfire and explosions that had become almost comforting in its consistency suddenly ceased. Henry felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the fighting had stopped, but the war was far from over. What new horrors would the dawn bring? The fighting had finally subsided. An eerie calm settled over the battlefield, leaving the soldiers to grapple with the aftermath of the tumultuous conflict. Henry found himself perched on a fallen log, his rifle resting across his knees, a stark reminder of the violence that had just passed. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the earthy scent of churned-up soil. It was a cocktail of odors that seemed to cling to his nostrils, refusing to let him forget the brutality of war. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Henry's mind wandered back to the beginning of his journey. The beauty of the sunset seemed almost obscene against the backdrop of destruction that surrounded them, a cruel juxtaposition of nature's indifference to human suffering. He remembered the paralyzing fear that had gripped him like an icy hand, squeezing the breath from his lungs as he faced the prospect of battle for the first time. The memory of his moment of cowardice, when he had turned and fled from the fight, burned in his chest like a hot coal. His heart raced at the recollection, shame and regret coursing through his veins. But now as he looked at his dirt-streaked hands and felt the weight of his recent acts of bravery, those fears seemed to belong to another person entirely. The transformation he had undergone was as dramatic as a caterpillar emerging from its chrysalis. He was no longer the wide-eyed youth who had left his mother's farm with dreams of glory and heroic deeds. Instead, he had become a battle-hardened soldier who understood the true nature of courage and the brutal reality of war. As this realization washed over him, Henry felt a shift within himself. Real bravery, he now knew, wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to act in spite of it, to push forward even when every instinct screamed for retreat. This newfound understanding settled over him like a warm blanket, bringing with it a sense of peace he hadn't expected to find in the midst of such chaos. Henry's gaze drifted to his fellow soldiers, men who had become more than just comrades in arms. His relationship with Wilson, in particular, had deepened into something akin to brotherhood. They had shared the crucible of combat, facing death side by side, and emerged stronger for it. A small smile tugged at the corner of Henry's mouth as he watched Wilson cleaning his rifle, the familiar routine a stark contrast to the mayhem they had just endured. For the first time since joining the regiment, Henry felt a true sense of belonging. He was no longer an outsider, a boy playing at being a soldier. He had become an integral part of this tight-knit group, bound together by shared experiences that no outsider could truly understand. The weight of this realization settled on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a source of strength and pride. Yet even as he basked in this newfound sense of camaraderie, Henry couldn't completely shake the memories of his earlier cowardice. The lie about his head wound, a fabrication born of shame and fear, still gnawed at him. But as he turned these thoughts over in his mind, Henry began to see them in a new light. These experiences, painful as they were, had shaped him. They were the chisel and hammer that had carved him into the man he was becoming. The regiment began to stir, preparing to move on to their next engagement. Henry stood, brushing the dirt from his uniform with a practiced motion. As he fell into line with his fellow soldiers, he realized that he was no longer the boy who had left home filled with romantic notions of war. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who carried with him the hard-won wisdom of his experiences. As they marched forward, the rhythmic sound of their footsteps echoing in the twilight, Henry felt a sense of readiness for whatever lay ahead. He had been forged in the fires of battle, emerging stronger, wiser, and forever changed. The path before him was uncertain, but he would face it with the courage he had discovered within himself, shoulder to shoulder with the brothers he had found in the chaos of war. The last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, giving way to the first twinkling stars. As darkness fell, Henry looked up at the vast expanse above him, feeling both small and significant. He had faced his fears, confronted his weaknesses, and come out the other side. Whatever battles lay ahead, both on and off the field, he knew he was ready to face them. The war had changed him, but it had also revealed his true strength. And as he marched into the night with his comrades, Henry felt a sense of peace and purpose that he had never known before.
This book was generated using Speakter's AI voices. You can create human-like voiceovers in over 50 languages.